Our first section, part 1, is really going to be about the beginnings of your experience and kind of educating you on the spiritual life. Now, the reason why I say it's the beginning is because if you take an even look at the meditations, if you've never done the meditations, he sends you to part 2, because in part 2 he's going to talk about prayer. So so this is really kind of the introduction that's going to guide the soul from its first desire to fulfill that resolution to have a spiritual life in some way, to have some sort of devout life. And I think that what's important is that he starts with trying to explain what true devotion is not. And he calls it, this is fake devotion, and it's the fake devotion because, and he says, I am going to tell you right up front that this is fake devotion so you don't waste your time. And you also don't make mistakes. Because there are many people who think they have a devout life, they have a spiritual life, but they really do not. So remember now, he is speaking as a spiritual director to Philothea, who is sort of a God lover. And people have asked him to write this so that he's writing it as a spiritual director. So he says that our devotions are really colored by our own likeness and our own dispositions, whether we're a little angrier, whether we're a little happier, a little joyful. All of them are colored by that. So we do visible acts, oftentimes that look like devotion, but they're fake. So in the fake devotion, so that you'll know what real devotion is. Because we can waste a lot of time in the spiritual life making mistakes if we don't know what real devotion is. And chase after what he calls kind of profitless shadows. The shadows that look like spirituality, but they are not. What I like is he uses 3 acts of prayer, right? He says that people who can fast perfectly, they love fasting, but they have hate and slander in their heart. And if they have hate and slander in their heart, that's not true devotion. So people can pray a lot, but they don't refrain from anger and insult. And I have that all the time. People say, you know what? That's just the way I am. Like, if you have ever said, that's just the way I am, you are no longer on the spiritual life. Because if you just accept that you are impatient, then there's no work that God could do in you. But the goal, the idea is hopefully to work through our vices, to work through these things that really we believe separate us from God. He says there's some people who have, the almsgiving, they have an open purse, they give very, very generous, but they close their heart. They have an open purse for almsgiving, but he calls it closed heart for forgiveness. And this is what's important, is that for us, the spiritual life is connected to the way you live. You cannot be a spiritual person if you don't live like a spiritual person or a devout person or a person in relationship with God. And so it doesn't make any sense to us whatsoever that someone would just say that they have this deep spiritual life and they commune at the beach and everything and they love all of that and yet live an immoral life. That we would say anyone it may be spiritual, but it's not spiritual with God. Because God linked the moral life and the spiritual life. That's why you're going to see, we're going to end up talking about the virtuous life. You have to live a virtuous life, trying to root out the vices in our life and the temptations, and then making ourselves prepared for God to do that within us. Because it's not just like you're going to do it all yourself. God does the work, and you'll see that. So many times we do spiritual acts, visible acts, that look like devotion, but he says they're all fake. It's not real, true devotion. I think we have that. See that maybe even in our own life, where we're just so willing to do our prayers and to do our Lectio Divina, and yet we don't have a generous heart at all. It never touches sort of our gossiping. Then you're like, well, what kind of devotion do you really have? He says devotion presupposes, and spirituality presupposes first love of God. So love of God and charity, we do the acts in charity, and he's going to say that charity is important But devotion is the fullest expression, the fullest perfection, in that the acts of charity are carefully, deliberately, and promptly done with devotion. So, and you'll hear what I mean by this. I love this analogy. You probably, if you've read it, you see. He talks about an ostrich and a hen and an eagle. And he says the ostrich never flies. It never flies. It's like sinners' movement are earthbound. And he says, but then there are hens. Hens, they fly, but they fly with a lot of difficulty. You know, they're well-meaning people who do charities, but they do it rarely, or they do it slowly, or they do it heavily. They do it begrudgingly. And he says, and then you have eagles. And eagles, they soar high and they fly always. They rise up to God frequently, swiftly, soaringly. You know that idea when you see the good, that sometimes it just takes a lot of effort to do the good. And we do it begrudgingly, you know. So the idea in the devout life is, you will see, that it's not just about doing good things, but doing them swiftly, quickly, without even thought. And doing them full of joy and happily. So I love the idea of these three. And I found this quote from Mother Teresa where she says, one thing will always secure heaven for us: the acts of charity and kindness with which we have filled our lives. Do no great things, only small things with great love. And that's the big part of the difference between the hen and the eagle, is they do great things, but infrequently, with sometimes a lot of grudgingly. It's like, well, of course, I'm supposed to do that because I'm Christian, because I love God, so I have to do that. I have to go be kind to people. But if I didn't have to, I would not do it. You know, and so he says good people are filled with love, and they do good charity, but devout people do these works of charity with great excitement. They love the good that they're doing. So he has this wonderful, another imagery about recovering from illness. And so on this journey, when we're beginners, we're recovering from, let's say, sin. One walks only so far and slowly, like the converted sinner. So it's this one here. You know, only when they're told to walk, they can only walk slowly and infrequently and painfully along the way as you begin. He says, but those who do devotion do it with quickly. They jump and run and leap as they move. He often made another connection between devotion and love by the fire and the flame. So what devotion ends up doing is devotion ends up adding the love, the eagerness, the energetic, the diligent. You know, where one doesn't just obey God's commands, but one delights and loves doing God's commands. Make sense? So that's what he says. So that's the journey that we're going to be on. So now the nature and the excellence of devotion. So then he tries. So one of the things that will be clear is that the world will see, as you begin this journey of devotion, toward devotion, and you begin excitement about going to adoration and spending time with the Lord and helping the poor, and you love doing it, the world will see this devotion as crazy. Why are you wasting your time doing such things? Right? Why do you spend 4 hours at church when you could spend time with me in front of the television? Right? Which is so much better. So, right? So he's like, devotion, they will try to discourage you in true devotion. So can you imagine now, we think it's today, right? We say today, oh, you know, all these people, they're not religious. It's been around for a long time. 400 years ago, he said to his spiritual directees, be careful because the worldly people will try to discourage you from this journey, this true devotion. The world sees religion as He says gloomy people, unpleasant people, self-righteous people, judgmental people. And so the world sees the people of religion as that kind of... When I look out there at Mass, I see some beautiful people out there who do great things and give of themselves amazingly and would help on a dime. And then I turn on the TV and they characterize us as these gloomy, unpleasant, self-righteous, judgmental people. And I'm like, where's the difference? Nothing new. He said that 400 years ago. He said, but actually, devout life is sweet. It's happy. It's lovable. And as a matter of fact, if it's not for you, then what you're seeking is fake. It's not, you're not on the right track. Because that's what it should produce in everyone. Because anyone who's going to move closer to God could not help that happen. And sometimes if you're going to fake it, you're going to still be filled with all of your own vices, and you're just going to try to look it. And when you do, you will look unpleasant and difficult and unhappy, because what you've got is a lot of things you're doing without the source that brings life to it all. So that's why the world sees devout people to do things that are hard, right? Because it's so hard to do. When we think of Mother Teresa, that was so hard for her to do that. But what they don't see is they don't see the inwardness that brings life to all that they're doing, that makes these acts pleasant and they make them easy. How you know if you're moving into devout life is that it's easy to do. And Christ said, my burden is easy. My burden is light. My way is easy. And you're like, no, it can't be. The only reason why it's hard for us is because we're still way attached to the world. We still have things attached to the world that we love more than God. And that's why it's still hard for us. That's the only way, he says, that like the martyrs. The only way the martyrs, when they're being tortured, it's like sweetness. It's with great devotion. And there's no bitterness in it. And you're like, how can that be? Because one of the things that devotion does, it is the sweetest, he says, of sweets, the queen of all virtues. It's the perfection of love. And I love his analogy where he's going to talk about the difference between love and then devotion. So devotion is a kind of love, but it's the perfection of that love. So he talks about milk is love. Devotion is cream. The plant is love, which is a beautiful thing. But when you have devotion, it's like the blossom on the plant. So he said that's why there's this excellence. It's moved toward the sort of the Olympics of the spiritual life when you have devotion. Next, he says, is that devotion is available to everyone, and it is suited to every vocation and profession. There are different exercises of devotion for each of the vocations. What lay people have to stop doing is stop imitating religious and Carthusians and the monks and nuns and find the devotion that is proper to their vocation. And that's why he says each brings the fruit of devotion according to the kind of vocation. So there are different exercises that are required for each vocation, and they're modified by the strength of the calling and the duties that you have. And I love it because, and this is the one that they read is one of the ones that they read in the Office of Readings that we have to read on his feast day. Because he says that a bishop cannot act like a Carthusian, and a family man cannot act like a religious man, and an artisan cannot be in the church all day, because he's got things to do. And as long as he does them with great devotion. So he says, mistake is made when there is no discrimination. No discrimination between real devotion and the indiscretion of those who fancy themselves to be devout, because they now look like a nun praying their rosary in the church. And I love it. He says, it's just as bad for a lay person who's got children at home to spend 5 hours in a church than it is for a religious to spend only no time in the church and be out there in the world. It's wrong in its vocation and devotion. So he says, true devotion hinders nothing. If you have real devotion, instead, it will perfect your life. True devotion will make your life as a layperson perfected. Perfected artisan, he's a mechanic. It will perfect your life as an artist. It will perfect your life in whatever work you're doing. The work, if you've got true devotion going on in your life, that will perfect all of it. And this is one of my favorite images that he uses. God did this. And what he says is, all duties of one state of life are done better and lighter when they're done with devotion. And then he says, a bee sucks honey from the flower without damaging the flower, because that's what a bee is designed to do. Leaving the flower whole and fresh as it was found. When we try to take honey from a flower, God did not design us that way, so we destroy the flower if we try to do what the bee does. But that's what the bee does well. He says, when everyone fulfills his or her special calling, better than the subject of the influence of devotion, he says, family duties are lighter. Married love is better. When all is done better and lighter when it's done with devotion, because it's the way God has designed your life. And you find the devotion that matches your life. He says it's an error, and he says, what's even interesting, he says, it's a heresy to seek to banish the devout life from any of the secular areas that you live in. He even uses like a soldier's guard room, or a mechanic's workshop, or the prince's court, or your home. Right? You need to see that that's where you will be perfected, is in the life that you live, not in the way Mother Teresa lived her life, because that was her calling. And she was given the graces to live that life that you have not been given. Any more than the caterpillar was not given the ability to suck the honey or the nectar or whatever it gets from the flower without damaging it. But the bee does it perfectly. So that when you have found what it is God has given you as the gift, then you start your life of devotion, it will be done perfectly. It will be done well. Be done. So, this is the more difficult part. To get on this road, he says, you have to find a guide. You have to find someone, some spiritual director, some advisor, some person who will journey with you. And that's tough. And he goes back to Teresa of Avila, where he says, you can try as hard as you want on your own, but you will never reach the heights, of those who have spiritual directors. Because the spiritual director begins to see your heart, because my own spiritual director said this to me, just remember that the ability for self-deception is limitless. You start on this journey, you can fool yourself into anything and believing anything. And what's funny is that I'll have us, listen to someone, my directee, and I'm thinking, are you sure? Because I don't think that makes sense. Oh, yes, it does. Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm not going to fight with you, but I don't think that's the way it works. But it's amazing how the ability, and we're defensive about these things. When I tell people, okay, first, spiritual direction, you have to read the Bible. You have to read the Gospels. St. Jerome says, ignorance of Scripture is ignorance of Christ. Now, what do you think comes back almost immediately when I say that? I don't have time to read the Bible. I said, well, then leave here. I don't have time to sit with you. Because if it's not going to be about Christ, then if you're not going to read the Scriptures and you don't know Jesus, I say, tell me your favorite Gospel passage. Not the birth and the death, because everybody knows that. And don't choose the prodigal son, because everybody knows that one. Tell me your favorite parable about Jesus. And then you can see I don't know, and you go, well, what kind of spiritual direction do you think this is? I mean, it's not generic, right? wanting you to be one with the big one, out there. It's about revelation from Jesus Christ of God who has revealed to us His Father and invites us into that life of the Trinity. How could you not know Him? You have to read the Scriptures. That's all there is to it. And if you tell me that you don't have time, I tell you I don't have time either for you. Because it's going to be to fall in love with God. For the Christian, the definition of God, the image of God, comes through Christ. That's where it comes through. And anything, even as we use philosophy, any kind of thing to get as part of natural, what we call natural revelation, it could never contradict divine revelation. Divine revelation, what Christ has revealed to us, and then throughout the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, in terms of its anticipation of Christ, and then its understanding of who Christ is. So, and if you find a spiritual director who's not going to talk about Jesus, then I think you need to go find someone else. Or you can go find the Hindu spiritual director if you want that. Find out what you want and go do it. But if it's going to be Christian, one of the things that we have to talk about that he gives as advice is in the spiritual director, you have to be ready and willing to offer your will to the spiritual director. Obedience. And obedience to the spiritual director and submitting your will is the beginning of submitting your will to God. And that's why obedience is going to be an important part to your spiritual director. So that you do what he tells you or she tells you to do. And it'll make sense after a while. It may not make sense, especially if he or she is finding some really worldly part of you. You will reject it. You will kind of fight against it, because they always do, because of our attachment to the world. But oftentimes, you only see the truth when you let it go. Alright? And you let it go. So, you have to submit your will, and it reminds to God's ministers so that you can better submit your will. It's practice to submitting your will to God. The spiritual director should be a religious person, but not to be a religious. Right. Should be what do you mean by religious person? You can find, there are professional spiritual directors and their sisters. Like, there's a whole spiritual direction program down at Marie Joseph Spiritual Center. The sisters do spiritual direction. Okay? So look for someone, most importantly, who fears the Lord. He gives his advice. And then he asks that you pray. Pray that God will give you a good director after God's heart, after the heart of God. Okay? And what happens too is don't see your spiritual director, once you find one, don't see him as just a human being, but pray that God speaks to you through him or her. And you deal with him in all sincerity and faithfulness and an open heart, showing both the good and the evil in your life. And this is the hard part, because there's something of a perfectionist in us, that we already want to be perfected, so we don't want to reveal some of the things in our heart. Now, the person, the spiritual director, it is there to help. But like any doctor, you can't help you if you don't tell him what's wrong. And there are a lot of people that you got to root out the evil in your life before any kind of healing, can happen. And oftentimes there's a lot of images coming up, but you have to take the pus out of the sore so that then it can begin to heal in our life. Anytime that if you're going to get a spiritual director and you feel like you are concealing something from him or her, that you don't want to tell them this or that, then you know that you're already in a poor relationship with your spiritual director. And if you're not making any gains, then that could be the reason. And he says, though, there are not many good spiritual directors, so be careful and ask for God's help when you start this journey to the devout life. So, next is first step. You go to confession, and he's going to tell you, go to confession and confess your sin. But remember that you still have the attachment to the sin. And the spiritual direction helps remove the attachment to the sin. That's why people say, I keep saying the same thing over and over and over again. I hate going to confession because I have no new sins. I said, why? You want more? You want some new ones? You don't like the ones you have? It's kind of like, why? You want some new ones? So my sense is like saying, look, That's because you haven't yet started on the journey to remove your attachments from these sins. And that's what we'll talk about next, is the attachment to the sin. Just so you know, if impatience is a sin that it's a vice that you're dealing with, one of the things I often give which everybody hates, is I say, well, you've got to work on the patience, so stand in the longest line at the grocery store. And deal with that. See what it's doing to you. And then you say, you know what? I am going to choose the longest line because I need to begin to my part at purifying my impatience. And I got to start that process. Okay? So, let's talk about the first step. It says, is purifying the soul. So, this happens slowly. So the soul that aims to become the spouse of Christ, he says, forsake sin, shave away every impediment that can hinder that love for God. If the whole point of this, that's why people go to confession, they think I'm concerned about their sins. I'm like, what do you think this is? Like the gossip room or something? I mean, why would I care about your sins? What I care about is how to move you out of them. Right? I mean, wouldn't it be great if the confession was out of business? Not because people sinned and didn't confess, but because eventually in heaven there would be no need to go to confession. The goal is to move you out of that. So that's why if you're starting on the first thing you do is to begin the purification of the soul. And the very step toward that, the very first step has to be, for spiritual health, is to be pruned from our sinful ways. So ordinary purification is accomplished slowly, step by step, gradually, and painfully. It is not a microwave spirituality. All right? This is what we're talking about, is a lifetime commitment to holiness. He says that ordinary purification is always by degrees. And he says the soul rises. This is another beautiful image. So every time you see the sun rise, he says the soul rises out from sin to the devout life. He's compared to like the dawn. It says the dawn, which does not banish darkness suddenly. It's not like all of a sudden like when we're at the movies and we turn the lights on, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, it burns my eyes, right? But when you watch the sunrise, it's slowly. So darkness comes, and we talk about twilight, and the sun kind of, sunrise, sunset. We talk about where it begins, and it doesn't hurt your eyes. It's gentle. It moves up, so that then you get the full light of the day. And I think that's a beautiful. So it comes in degrees, and he says, but the difference really is, and this is true, and we all know it, is that sin takes no time to take root in your life. It comes fast. Fast, and bad habits are easy to take on. He said, but sin takes a long time to root out. Bad habits are easily taken on. You can start swearing in no time. But to break the swearing is a hard thing to do. So of course he's going to say, eventually, be careful. Be careful, because even when things are not, I'll give you a heads up, even when things are not wrong, see, they're not wrong, be careful with them, because you can easily become addicted to them, and then now you've got to root them out of your life. So that's why. And all too often, he says, the purification is that we have impatience. Why do I keep repeating the same sin? That's the first step of purifying the soul. But then, he says, all too often, people become disheartened because he's still subject to the imperfections. After having made so many attempts toward the devout life, I am still at 80 years old, can't control my tongue. Why is that? So he knows that this is, he'll say there are parts of us that will always be with us. But he says the other end is this guy. I found a nice picture on this guy. It's the same era. Not just being discouraged because everything took so long, but that they think that they're already freed now from all the imperfections. After reading Introduction to Devout Life, they're done. Did a little thing, did their 10 meditations. They're fine now, and they're perfectly fine. He says there are some people that once they start, they think they're freed after 4 days, and they're fine. That both of these are errors. So this is what he gives us. You need humility, courage, perseverance, all the way till the end. He said, being afflicted by imperfections will continue until you die. That's just the way it is, because you're not on this side of eternity. So for people who are perfectionists, this can challenge you, because you want to be holier than you are and you can't deal with it, that you're not. And then, of course, the whole Gospels come in, and St. Paul comes in and says, my grace is enough for you. Because remember that this is going to be about loving God. It's going to be about having a devout life. And that's what's going to be important. I used to tell, the people when they were thinking of becoming a priest, and I was dealing with the priesthood, and they'd be like, it's 6 years from now. I said, look, 6 years from now, you'll be 6 years older. And it'll still be 6 years from now. So just start now. And he's like, but I'm not, they want to be a priest. But look at all the good that can happen now with the good that you're allowed to do as a seminarian, as you can lead people. You may not say Mass yet, but that's okay. You can still do lots of teachings. You can be like the seminarian who does the devotions. But, there's people who have only the goal, and that's all they want until they get that goal. I'm like, it's okay. Just enjoy the journey. Enjoy the journey with the spiritual life. Hopefully he has not even told you yet what to do, but he's giving you this backup, right? So the first purification is from mortal sin. The first thing he says is that you have to go to confession. That if you're in the state of mortal sin, you can't begin this journey life. You can't start spiritual direction until you go to confession. Because the goal in confession is to hate the sin. To hate the sin and be sorry for sins. And that's one of the things that's hard for us, because we've learned what the sins are, but we're not often hateful of the sin. I fight with my husband. I don't hate that. I'll fight with him again tomorrow if he says the same thing, right? And I am not sad about the fact that we argue all the time. It's just the way we are, as opposed to having the virtuous life. And so he says, strive to hate your sin and to be sorry for your sins. Now, that will not start tomorrow. And if you go through the meditations, we'll talk about, that's beginning the goal, beginning the process of hating sins. You don't wake up tomorrow and hate the things that you've loved to do your entire life. I still remember one time, the idea is that one of the things we have to admit sometimes is that we love our sins. We love to gossip. There's nothing like a juicy story that you have to hang in to tell somebody. It's like, and know that if you say this, because I am a fellow journeyer, all right? I know I shouldn't be telling you, but which is even worse, because you know what you're doing and you're going to do it anyway. I know I shouldn't be saying this, but this is way too juicy to keep to myself. All right? So the goal, hopefully, is in the purification is to begin the process of hating sin. And you'll see this in all of the spiritual writings of the 10 books, that I put out, because it is the first step in the spiritual life. So you need to remember 4 things, though, he says, in this purification. Remember that by sinning, you have lost God's grace, and that you have rejected your share of paradise that began with your baptism. Okay, this is a gift that started already in your life. Eternal life started the day you were baptized. That's when the grace was given to you. And you're rejecting it. And that you are accepting instead the pains of hell. Not just hell, eternal hell, because that's true. But you're accepting the pains of hell that you have started in your life. That's why we call them demons. We believe that hell, just as heaven and glory is here, so is evil. And so I tell kids, look, you'll lie to your parents. You know now that you have broken the trust. You break that trust, hell begins to be a part of your life now because you expect your parents to trust you again. And that's a bigger expectation than they deserve to have on their life. Same thing with a husband and wife, sometimes they'll come to sit with me they've committed adultery. There's adultery there, and it's amazing how the spouse who has committed adultery says, I'll use it for a he, but this is she. He doesn't trust me anymore. She doesn't trust me if I'm not home on time. I'm like, you created that hell. That's your fault. It's not up to you anymore to demand that she trusts you. You've already broken that, and hell has begun for you. More hell has preceded because of your life. This would not be in your world if you had not brought it in. But we don't want to take no responsibility. And it's amazing how, just like in Adam and Eve, it's her fault for not trusting me. I told her she should trust me. And I'm like, you have no right, after breaking that trust, to demand that she should just roll over and trust you again. You have raised the bar in your world so that you now have to answer for a higher trust that was broken. And sometimes they say, I do trust him now. And that's good. But I know deep down in the back, it's gone. And that's what you've brought in to this relationship now. And that's hell. Again, because it's not the love and the trust that should be there. So remember, that's what happens with sin. And you're renouncing God's eternal love that should be there. But that's the way it works. That's the way it always works. And so people who go to confession with the intention, though, of returning to their old sins, because they don't hate it anymore, right? That by not avoiding the near occasion of sin, or taking necessary measures to amend their life. The big issue, the big sin, is pornography on the website. Big, all over the place. Big trouble with men in our world today. It's exploding. Matter of fact, the number one, they say that why there's been so great advances in the internet is because of the influx of money to get films and chatting and everything going on. So we can thank for, the big progress we have made is because of sin, right? But if I say, get rid of your computer, they're like, absolutely not. I can't. I need it. I have to have it. I'm like, well, then what do you want me to do? It's like saying that you're an alcoholic and leave the bottle right there on your table. Well, they said, but everything else. I said, do you know there are people, it's harder now because your attachment now to this sin, it's harder to break. It is. It will be. It's sacrificial that you're going to have to make. But if you're not willing to make this, then you will continue in that sin for a long time. And that's just the way it always works. You cannot tell someone who's an alcoholic that you can put all that alcohol right in front of you. And it might be fine for a day, 2 days, 5 days. But what happens when pressure comes and you're alone? What happens when you're quiet, lonely, hungry, afraid, hurting? What happens? I mean, that's the way that's the way we've always been. But it's been hard for us because our lives are so wrapped up, we can't pull ourselves away so easily. That's what it does. But the very cure is going to be painful. If anybody can come up with an easier way, let me know. But sometimes, we could put things on the computer, let's say, but then you have to tell someone. And then that someone has to kind of have the code so that you're protected. But you have to do something. Because if you keep doing what you keep doing, you keep getting what you keep getting. And that's the difficulty with someone. Now, this is for someone who's interested in a devout life. If you're just interested in being a good person like a hen instead of an eagle, then you can be a hen. That's fine. And you will fly infrequently and clumsily and painfully sometimes. But if you want to be a hen in the spiritual life, go ahead. I'm not going to stop you. All right? So, and then I invite you to make a general confession, steady and fix yourselves to starting anew. Remember the act of contrition. Oh my God, I am heartily sorry for having offended you. And I detest all my sins because of your just punishment or the pains of hell. But most of all, because they have offended you, my God, who are all good. So, the idea, oh my God, I'm heartily sorry for having offended you, and I hate all of my sins. But most of all, because they've offended you, who are all good and deserving of all my love. So the prayer is telling you exactly what St. Francis de Sales is trying to tell you it should be in your life. That you really do hate these sins. But not because of me, because I might go to hell, or I might be, but because they have hurt you, Lord, who are all good and deserving of all my love. One of the things that it's important is that in the second purification from all sins and affection is penitents who forsake sin, right? Yet without forsaking their sinful affections for them, which is different, right? Because not only is it about sinning, it's about the things, the affection toward that sin, that we have. Then they intend to sin no more, but only sorely against them to abstain from that pleasure that comes from the sin. He says this, which I like right here. So, the sick man loves melons. So that's one thing that's beautiful about St. Francis de Sales. He has lots of easy images. And if you've got the melon image, they love melons. But they can't have melons because melons make them sick. And it will kill her, if she eats melons. But she longs for melons, right? She bargains when she can have it. How about now? Is it okay now? Maybe this is justified now. Or, well, if only you knew everything, then, you would. So you do all the bargaining. It says, you smell the melons. Think, all those who can eat the melons, you're so lucky you can eat melons. If only I could eat. And then you could transfer that to almost any sin. You're so lucky that, that you can do this. Because I'm Catholic, I can't. You're so lucky you can get divorced, because we're Catholics, we can't. That kind of thing. And so you realize that the, this idea of the melons, you're like, oh, look how wonderful and happy they are, because they get to eat melons and I can't. And that's, I think, the biggest thing, that we have to be careful of. So the weak, cowardly penitent, he says, abstains a while, but reluctantly. And they wish that they could sin without going to hell. That's if it wasn't for my faith, I'd kill you right now. Right? If it wasn't, that phrase, right? Or, if it wasn't because if I was Catholic, I'll have to because I'm Catholic, but this idea that anytime that you're not, you wish you could do it, and that sin still has trapped your heart, and you have yet to be on that devout life. A person may not actually commit the sin, but may be bound by that sin. One of the things I remember that I was watching is I knew someone who had the gastric bypass, which I know I should have, but anyway. So anyway, I was watching her because I was curious. So we were together for Christmas. And she had the gastric bypass. It was a friend of mine from high school. And so all the food was there, but she can only eat a little. So she was eating just a little. And then we're all done. And then came out the cake. and the brownies and the stuff. And I was watching her because I love to watch people reactions. See what's she going to do? And I could see her in the middle of the conversation staring at the brownies and looking at the cake. And then I saw her take a little piece of the brownie and eat it. And then I watched her for a little while, and then she looked at the cake. She takes a little piece of the cake, and all the time I'm thinking, see, you still have the attachment. And that ultimately is going to get you right back where you are again, because for all of us we know, if you watch The Biggest Loser, which I loved, I watched for years, it's all here, right? I know that. It's all here. I tell that to Lisa all the time. I'm like, Lisa, I got to take care of this. I've got to take care of this. It's my demon that I got to deal with. And so it's not just staying away from the sin, but it's cleaning the heart from the affections that pertain to that sin. The bigger danger of relapse and the weakening, your mind and clogging it. So this is what I'd like you to do if you get a chance to do that, is that one of the things he recommends in the meditation, so you saw the meditations, he would ask that you use them in the order that they appear and use one a day. And he said he recommends, as your spiritual director for the next couple of weeks, is to do it in the morning. Some people, I'm not a morning person, so we'll do it in the morning, whether you like it or not. Just do it, all right? Because one of the things he says is because then you can ponder it throughout the whole day. If you do it at night, you go to bed, you might dream about it, but probably not. It might go. But ponder it throughout the whole day, even if you have to leave little slips so that you remind about what it is you're talking about. The first 3 are on creation, the next 6 are on sin, and then the last 3 are on eternal life and on paradise and the whole purpose of it all. Okay? So we'll end there. If you're following along in the book, we ended right around page 13. But there are a lot of those. You go through the meditations pretty fast. That's why. So you can see how. So anyway, we'll go through some. We'll go a little faster because I think this is the more important thing. And one of the things we talk about is that just remember that the biggest fan, and everybody wants to know. Some of you have been around me long enough, you know I say this, is that everybody says, why did God make the Israelites go through the desert for 40 years? Right? And part of it, when you read the story of their time in the desert, it's because God took them out of Egypt. But He needed to get Egypt out of them. And that's really important if you read it, because they often will say, anytime anything difficulty happens, they say, don't you remember our time in Egypt when we ate cucumbers, and all of that? It's like, we need to go back there. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You guys were in slavery. But that's what happens to us, is that we dream about, I wish I could go back to the time when I could eat that cake, and I was just so happy when I ate that cake. Right? Until I eat the cake, and then I'm like, why did I eat that cake? And it's like, you should know better than that. But that's the game that gets played over and over again, because the affection is still there. And to root out that takes a long, long, long time. All right? And that's what's important in the spiritual life. Okay? So let's do a little glory be. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit.